So what are the challenges that you face when you're actually doing testing in a staging environment? One is basically limited scale. Yes, your test environment or your staging environment will not be as powerful as your production environment. You may not actually have the same CPU capacity or the memory capacity, or the number of servers that you might be using may not be as good as what you actually have in a production environment. Now, when it comes to applications also, there might be differences. So what I've seen is like you may not actually have failover servers configured. When you're doing testing in production, you should also be aware of the risk that it can actually cause. One is basically if you're trying to actually put an unstable code into production, there's a good chance that you can actually go and corrupt the data that is already there. It can definitely cause application slowness. There has been a lot of discussion around doing testing, performance testing in production. It can definitely slow down your application. Or if you have a large number of testers, maybe like 50 testers coming and doing some type of test on a particular feature, it can definitely slow down your application. Now, there are various ways of doing testing in production. There are at least I would say like 10 to 12 different ways. The first one being code instrumentation. The second method that is very useful is basically called real user monitoring. Now, let's quickly take a look at some of the best practices that you can actually look at from testing in production standpoint. One is don't try to do testing when there are a large number of users using your system. You should also be looking at the benefits as well as the risk associated with each of these types of tests or practices that we discussed in the previous slide, and then picking the right types of tests based on your use case.
Hi everyone. We are moving to our next session, which I think is quite relevant and quite interesting for all of you, and it is testing in production will grow or die. And this session is from George Ukkuru, Chief Solutions Officer at Test House. A little bit about George. Um, a little bit about George. George has more than 45,000 hours of experience working with global 1,000 firms to enhance product quality, decrease release time, and cut down costs. As a result, he has been able to touch more than 50 million customers by providing them with enhanced customer experience. Functional testing of products was his first job, and he later worked in test automation, RPA, DevOps. So he has developed a strong reputation as the go-to person for everything automation related because of his experience. So enjoy the session.
Hello everyone.
I'll just play.
Welcome to Conflicts. This is George Ukkuru, and today I'm actually going to take you through a presentation around testing in production. So what you're basically going to look at is whether this practice of testing in production is actually going to grow in the recent future, or is it a practice that is actually going to die off soon? That is what we're trying to understand as part of this particular presentation. So we'll actually look at how testing in production has evolved over the last couple of years or decades. We'll actually look at why is that someone should be actually deciding on testing in production, or what are the challenges associated with testing in a staging environment or a pre-prod environment. Now, if you decide to do testing in production, what are some of the risks that you may actually come across? And then we'll also look at what are the ways of doing testing in production. So you decided to do testing in production now. So what are the ways in which you can actually do testing? And what are some of the best practices or things that you should be actually, implementing if you are actually deciding go ahead with your production testing? And then we'll also look at what are the benefits that you would actually get by actually testing in production. So these are some of the things that we are planning to actually cover in the next 25 to 30 minutes. So I've been working in this stream for the last, I would say, 23 years, and I've actually depicted what I've seen personally with respect to testing in production. So when I started my career, testing was mostly done in production. Many of the companies did not actually have a dedicated QA team. Neither they actually had a test environment. They were primarily doing development in a waterfall mode, where you're actually releasing maybe one build into production every year. Most of the applications were maybe like standalone applications, monolithic kind of applications, and then it was actually run on physical servers. So since there was no testing team, some development testing was done, but most of the testing would actually happen with real users, or someone from the company or the organization would actually go and do testing. It was completely immature way of doing testing, but maybe towards maybe 2004-5 time frame, things started getting better. Maybe in the last, I would say, maybe 2005 to 2015 time period, a lot of things got better with respect to testing. The application architectures changed. We actually have testing center of excellence or test factories in place where you have independent testing teams. We actually had two-tier or three-tier kind of applications coming in, and then later we actually had services-based architecture like REST APIs and SOAP-related applications coming in. There used to be dedicated environments for testing, maybe a dedicated environment for functional testing, dedicated environment for maybe performance testing. We actually started adopting agile testing practices and monthly releases. Even then, there is a small amount of testing that I've seen happening in production, but it was mostly done during the times when the user load was low or almost zero. So from my personal experience working with a retailer, especially around point of sale, the testing team members used to actually go and visit stores early in the morning before it actually opens up, and then they used to actually do one level of testing before you actually hand it over to the store employees. So this is basically after the pilot phase is done, or during the pilot, you basically do this level of testing to make sure that everything is fine. Because if your application is not going to work when the store opens, the impact is going to be very high. And this is not just one store; you're actually dealing with hundreds of stores. So this level of testing used to be very useful, but this was not this was done when there was almost, I would say, like zero users using your system. You're actually having testers going and doing this testing. So there are definitely benefits that would actually come out. There are scenarios where the build did not work and it actually had to be rolled back before the store employees came into work. The other, then I think the stage 3 is something that you see in today's world where you actually have microservices based architecture, serverless architecture, integrated testing teams and all of those in place. You actually have a lot of applications moving to the cloud. You actually have daily releases. You actually have continuous testing and deployment in place. Now, I think there are a good number of companies where I've seen testing happening in real time. So you're not actually just depending on testing to be done when no one is using your application. You're actually doing testing when you actually have users using your system, which is the current what you call stage, which is basically stage 3. So this is how I have seen testing evolving in production over the last maybe 2.5 decades. But I believe that at least I would say, like, if there are 100 companies, at least there are at least 10 of them who are actually doing one or the other form of testing in production. But we'll definitely look at what type of testing can be done and how that we can adopt some of these practices. Now, why is that someone should be actually deciding to do testing in production? So what are the challenges that you face when you're actually doing testing in a staging environment? This is something that is worth examining. And this basically, if you actually have enough challenges in testing in a staging environment, then you can actually, there can be a good use case for actually using an environment or a production environment to do some of your testing. One is basically limited scale. Yes, your test environment or your staging environment will not be as powerful as your production environment. You may not actually have the same CPU capacity or the memory capacity or the number of servers that you might be using may not be as good as what you actually have in a production environment. So you may not actually get the same level of performance unless you've actually invested in building the same configuration. Now, when it comes to applications also, there might be differences. So what I've seen is you may not actually have failover servers configured. You may not have the same queue size when you compare between a staging and a production environment. So you can actually see application level configuration differences also between a staging environment and a production environment. And some of the results that you might see from your application behavior also might have some level of dependency on these application configurations. There are chances that you may not have all the required application interfaces in place. I've personally seen a scenario where when I was actually doing testing for a Canadian-based company, we were supposed to actually test the integrations between an e-commerce website and the accounting software. The accounting software, the customer did not actually have licenses to actually put their accounting software in a test environment. And we never had an environment where we basically had this accounting software. And we were actually given, I think, 20 minutes of time during a weekend, during the midnight, where you are supposed to actually do this testing in real production servers because the interfaces did not exist in the staging environment to do any kind of testing with the accounting software. So there can be scenarios where you may actually have even dependencies on third-party software, which might not be something that you can actually set up in your staging environment. And the only possibility that you might have is to actually do testing on your production server once you actually deploy the build into production. However you test in the staging environment or test environment, I think there's always a benefit of doubt that I see, in the sense there's at least 1% chance that even though the best of the testers will not actually guarantee that it will actually work in production. They'll have 1% doubt on whether there's something that can go wrong when you actually put your build into production. So I've not seen anyone giving 100% of confidence during the release time stating that, okay, it has worked in staging, now it will definitely work in production. Don't worry about it. You don't even have to look at whether it is working or not. It definitely works. I very rarely have seen people coming forward and stating that. So there's always a problem around the confidence of releases. The other primary difference that I've seen with respect to staging and production is most of the jobs that you have in your staging environment, very rarely I've seen them to be scheduled. most of the time, since you're doing testing on your environment, you would actually like to run it every now and then. So you may actually decide to actually run it based on your choice rather than actually keeping it scheduled. Whereas in a production server, they actually run during a specified time frame. So your job schedules might be also different between staging as well as production. And most of these staging environments may not actually have application monitoring tools installed, or no one will be actually looking at monitoring your production servers, your staging servers on a regular basis. There might not be 24/7 monitoring. There might be monitoring happening, especially when you're running some kind of performance test on your staging environment. Your engineers might be monitoring the performance. So it's very rare that there's a very rare chance that you may actually have your monitoring tools installed on your staging environment. So there's a good amount of differences. And if you feel that any of these parameters, or there can be more parameters, at least these 6 of these parameters are actually significantly different between production and staging, then there might be a good use case to actually go and try out testing in production. But when you're doing testing in production, you should also be aware of the risk that it can actually cause. One is basically, if you're trying to actually put an unstable code into production, there's a good chance that you can actually go and corrupt the data that is already there. In the sense like, the one possibility is that a bug can actually cause data to be corrupted, which is rare. But there can be cases where your testing team themselves is actually trying to go and edit the data that's already there in production. They're actually going and modifying an account detail of a customer, and the entire thing will actually get messed up. So you're actually corrupting the data. So you should be making sure that you don't actually try out things like this, where you're actually going to modify the data that is there in production. No way you should be actually doing it. So you should be actually using your own data for your testing. So data corruption is something that you should be aware of, and you should be also having mechanism to roll back the database if there is something that goes wrong. But data corruption is quite common. It can be due to a bug, or it can be due to a tester modifying something during the testing. It can definitely cause application slowness. There has been a lot of discussion around doing testing, performance testing in production. It can definitely slow down your application. Or if you have a large number of testers, maybe like 50 testers coming and doing some type of test on a particular feature, it can definitely slow down your application. So application slowness is something that you can expect when you're trying to do testing in production, whether it is, mostly it is applicable to non-functional type of tests like performance. You'll also have to be very careful about compliances, especially if you're working in the healthcare side. You should actually be worried about HIPAA compliance. You should be also looking at GDPR. Your testers should not be actually accessing data that they are not supposed to access. In cases, and whenever they're doing testing, they should be actually looking at using their own data to actually run their test scenarios or test cases. So you'll also have to keep the compliance is a very serious issue. So you should be actually be looking at the compliance aspects also if you're actually deciding to test in production. And if you're trying to manipulate records, even though data is not getting corrupted, for example, I'm actually maybe testing a banking software and I'm actually going and changing the account balance of a person by actually withdrawing funds, a real customer, it's actually going to create a hell of a lot of problems. Your actually financial calculations can go wrong. Or if you're running an e-commerce website, I'm actually making a purchase, it gets accounted as a revenue. And you may actually have to go back and correct your records at the end of your testing. So you should actually have mechanisms to actually you should also be very careful. And you should have a mechanism to actually go and fix these issues by actually running a script and removing the records that you've created if you're actually using your own data. But there should not be any changes done to the existing records. So we talked about data corruption. You can also manipulate the data that is there, which can actually result in incorrect financial calculations. So you should be extremely careful when you do testing in production, not to touch anything that can actually cause miscalculation. It can be financial, or it can be even something that can affect a patient's life. You're dealing with something in healthcare. There's a definite chance that there can be an impact on customer experience. Yes, when you're doing testing, things can go wrong. Your customers can actually see issues coming up, and then they may decide to actually stop using your service, or they may actually go to a different site to buy a product. These are things that can really happen. So there is a probability that your customer experience can get impacted if you're actually doing testing and production. And there's also a chance that if you're actually trying to put too many features into production, it's very difficult to actually find out what has actually gone wrong when you're doing testing. So ideally, you should be actually testing smaller chunks of capabilities of features. So unless you do that, it becomes very difficult to actually isolate and then find out what is actually wrong when you're actually dealing with testing and production. It can also cause alert fatigues. For example, you're actually getting a huge number of errors when you're doing testing in production. You can actually send alerts to the operational staff. Or, for example, you're trying to actually create a record, maybe a stock price, and then you're actually going to change it. You can even send an alert to the financial analyst who may be sleeping in the night. So you should be making sure that you don't actually cause such kind of issues. Either you actually set the threshold or inform these people that you're doing something in production so that these kind of fatigue doesn't happen, because they may be getting n number of calls or emails telling that there's something wrong in production. So you should be actually not getting into a scenario where you actually create alert fatigue for the operational staff. So these are some of the risks. Some of them actually can create a big impact. Some are basically compliance related issues, and there are definitely ways of actually fixing it, which we'll definitely cover in the best practices section. Now, there are various ways of doing testing in production. There are at least I would say like 10 to 12 different ways. We're just looking at some of the easier methods of doing testing in production. The first one being code instrumentation. Nothing but you're actually adding some additional code into your software to actually see how your application is behaving. When the code is actually having a path where someone is actually getting into a function, when is the person coming out, what's happening within the code, how much time does it take? You're basically tracking performance and all of those things. You're basically doing some kind of profiling or instrumentation of the code to actually generate some insights on how your customers are using your product, how fast your application is actually responding. All of those things are actually done through instrumentation. So you're actually adding additional codes here. It's a pretty good method, but it actually comes with its own risk. I don't think it has the highest risk, but that can definitely cause performance issues because your code execution can become slower because you're actually having additional piece of code. It also becomes a problem for developers to actually maintain this code in the future, in the sense like if you're actually going to deal with changes to the code very frequently, if you're actually having all of these code within your existing code base, it becomes a bit of a problem for your developers to manage it. But it actually has its own advantages as well. The second method that is very useful is basically called real user monitoring, which is basically like you're actually looking at the behavior of users and how they're trying to use your application. Mostly a reactive method. You're actually seeing what pages they are using. You're actually seeing what kind of devices are they using, what browsers, why are they actually logging out from a particular workflow, things like that. So you're basically using the data around the usage patterns, and then you're actually trying to derive insights. And these insights can be used to improve your testing as well as to improve your overall product. Very less of risk there. There is definitely an overhead. Someone needs to be actually monitoring it. And there are a lot of tools that can actually help you to achieve this. For example, you have Google Analytics. You basically have App Dynamics, New Relic, and other products which actually has this real user monitoring capabilities. So testing is actually done on a production server. You're actually monitoring. You're not actually doing testing. You're actually doing monitoring. And then you're actually taking this action to improve your testing. Now, there's a variation to it where you don't have real users. You're actually trying to create artificial users or synthetic users to do this kind of test. The objective is very different. It's mostly proactive. For example, you can actually run a Selenium script every 1 hour on an e-commerce website to do some basic things like logging into the website, doing a product search, and then adding an item to the cart and then logging out. So you're basically looking at whether the person can perform a workflow. You're actually looking at the availability of a particular, software. Or we are also making sure that the workflow is also not impacted. There are no errors that are actually happening when a person is trying to do these basic operations. The same scenario can actually have a non-functional variation of it, where you basically look at maybe testing the performance of a particular page, maybe by actually sending pings from different parts of the world to actually see what is the average response time that it takes to actually load a page. It's very useful, mostly proactive approach. And you can also use this data to actually improve your product or take actions if you're actually seeing some kind of problems or symptoms in your production, software. Fourth one is very simple. You can actually run functional tests. You can actually run some basic tests on your microservices or REST APIs to make sure that everything is fine. Also you can actually maybe use the same scripts that I was talking about from a synthetic user monitoring standpoint to actually test some of the basic workflows of your product. The only thing, you can actually use any tool maybe a Selenium or Test Complete, UFT, OpKey, any of those tools to actually run these kind of tests on production. The only thing that you have to make sure is don't try to actually use any data from production. If you're doing some kind of testing, try to actually use the data that is actually manufactured by your script or by yourself to actually do these kind of tests. Then you have the actual, there are two other ways in which you can actually deploy applications into production and perform testing. The one is basically feature flagging. Basically, you may have a feature that is actually ready to be deployed to production, but there's a dependent feature. For example, there is a dependent feature that's not ready yet. Or you have a dependency on a third-party software, and the third-party company should actually be developing this feature in order for your customers to start using it. But you can actually go ahead and implement this feature in production, but you may turn it off until the dependent services are actually ready. That's one scenario. There's something called the feature flag segmentation. where you may actually try to actually group a set of capabilities or features together, and then you may decide to actually deploy those features into production. But the features will not be available for everyone. It will be only available for maybe a subset of users. For example, if you have 100 million users or 1 million users using your application, you may actually make this particular feature available only for maybe, I would say, maybe 100 users. And once you're comfortable, once these 100 users is actually giving you positive feedback, then you basically expose this to a larger number of users. This is actually a good method. You're actually reducing the risk of failure here. But at the same time, you're also creating overheads. There should not be too many flags within your application, which actually may cause issues when you're trying to debug your code. Your engineers who are actually working on the support side or the operation side may find it difficult to actually make bug fixes whenever there is a bug fix required, or it can even impact your application, performance, if you're having too many feature flags in place. But it's actually a good method. It actually reduces the risk associated with any kind of failures that can actually happen in production. And testers can actually do testing initially before it's even exposed to the larger set of people. Then you have a very good different method called blue-green deployment, where you actually have the current version of your production software working in a blue environment, and then you may actually deploy the new version of your product to a green environment. And the testers may initially get into the green environment, and then they'll be basically doing a set of tests on that green environment before it is actually exposed to a set of users. Even users may also do some level of testing on this green environment. And then once everything is fine, then you switch over. So your green server now becomes your blue server or your live server, where all your users will be diverted to this new server now. And if there is anything that goes wrong, you can still go back to your previous version. So it's pretty easy to do. But the only challenge is you may need to have this amount of infrastructure to actually manage two environments. You may have to spend a lot of money on buying these infrastructure and the resources to actually run these two environments. And then you should also be very careful about data replication. If some of your actual users are actually going to use both these environments, you need to have a mechanism using which you're actually going to replicate the data to the new environment whenever there is testing happening in production. The next two tests that I'm going to talk about are very risky type of tests. I won't even recommend running them in production. One is chaos engineering type of tests, which are primarily run for cloud-based applications. It's very risky to run them on environments like production. There are companies like Netflix who are actually running this, and the objective of running these tests are basically to make sure that your application is having enough resiliency. You're basically injecting failures into your production application or into your application, and then making sure that it can actually recover from the failure. And you also measure the mean time to recover from a failure. So there is a good chance that your application will definitely fail when you're trying to run these kind of tests. Unless you've actually done enough testing on a staging environment, it's very risky to actually try this out in production. So unless you actually have a good amount of maturity, like a Netflix, don't try to run these tests on a production environment. You should be definitely running it on a staging environment. And then we have achieved a good amount of maturity in running these type of tests in a staging environment. Then you can actually go and try it out in production. Now, the last type of test, a very controversial topic, should I be running performance tests in production? No. This is what I would actually recommend if you're actually having users in your system, because it can definitely improve your overall experience that is actually being delivered to your actual user. You're trying to run scripts, terminate heavy loads, your application can become slow. If there are bugs, it can even crash your servers, and you're actually going to lose all the revenue and the reputation because your site is actually going to be down for a certain amount of time. This can be definitely tested out. I've done this earlier when we were trying to launch a new e-commerce website. The site is not live. The application was actually installed in the production environment. At that point of time, we went ahead and actually installed these applications in production, and we did not install it. The application was already installed in production, but we ran a set of performance tests on production on the live environment, and we actually found out some issues, and then we were able to actually fix them before the site is officially launched. So you can only run tests in production provided there are no users, the site has not gone live. You have the application installed in production servers or the live servers, you can go and run it. Otherwise, it's very, very risky. So both chaos engineering tests and performance tests are the highest risk. Whereas I would say maybe code instrumentation, functional tests, feature flags, and blue-green deployments have medium amount of risk to be run on production servers. And then real-time user monitoring and synthetic user monitoring is less risky, but the benefits are also lesser compared with the other approaches. Now, let's quickly take a look at some of the best practices that you can actually look at from testing in production standpoint. One is don't try to do testing when there are a large number of users using your system. You should be actually doing you should be having a defined time frame in which you're actually carrying out these type of tests. So don't try to actually do testing when everyone is trying to use your system, so that you can minimize the impact when you actually have when you decide to actually do testing, whether it is functional or non-functional. You should also be looking at the benefits as well as the risk associated with each of these types of tests or practices that we discussed in the previous slide, and then picking the right types of tests based on your use cases. Don't try to do everything in production. You may have specific scenarios or pain points that you want to resolve. So you should actually pick those type of tests that are very important. For example, if you have a good environment to do performance testing, it doesn't make any sense for you to do testing in production and then mess up the entire thing. You should also be making sure that your production servers actually have continuous monitoring and infrastructure health monitoring happening, even during the time you're doing performance testing, so that it's very easy for the team to actually isolate issues. And it's also important to actually inform all the stakeholders, including your operational staff. If you're working in if you actually have alerts being sent into the people in the business, people, all I think developers, testers, DevOps engineers, everyone should be actually informed that you're actually doing testing in production, and you will sometimes require help from them to roll back things if things are actually going wrong. So it's very important to communicate about this to all the stakeholders. Do not use production data. You should not be touching any records that are there, even for inquiry, even for any kind of read-write operation. You should be actually using synthetically generating your own data or creating your data manually. And whatever data you're actually creating, you should be actually labeling it in a way it can be easily identified. Tomorrow, if you want to actually move these records or remove these records from your production database after the testing is done, it should be easily possible to do that with the help of a database administrator. For that, labeling is very important. And you should be also using accounts that actually have the lowest amount of the least privileges. You should not be using an admin account of your application to actually do testing and end up in a scenario where you delete all your customers. So you should be actually doing testing with the least privileges. Look at your scenarios that you're trying to execute in production and only use the required rights and privileges in those accounts that you're using to run your scripts or to actually do testing. You should actually have what you call a proven and tested rollback strategy in place. You should not be trying to attempt, you should not be actually even trying out testing in production if you don't have a proven and well-tested rollback strategy. So there should be a well-documented rollback procedure that is available, which can actually bring back your site to a normal state. Your mean time to recover should be very less, provided you actually have a proven rollback strategy in place. Try to minimize the amount of time that you use for testing. Use automated tools to do your testing. Do not actually sit and run tests for hours together by using a manual mode of testing. Try to actually use automation tools so that you can actually complete your testing in a very limited time. So there's some of the best practices. There can be many. In the interest of time, I've just put the key ones that I thought are very relevant. So I think we're coming to the end. So let's take a look at the benefits. So from my experience, what I've seen is testing in production comes with its own risk, but there are also benefits. And looking at the current mode of development, which is basically focusing on speed with quality, it's very important to at least do some level of testing in production so that you get the required level of confidence to actually make frequent releases. So definitely you can actually look at improving your time to market. Your developers, your entire product team will be more confident to actually put releases into production if you're actually doing some testing in production. And the advantage that you get is you're actually limiting the failure impact, in the sense like if something is wrong, you're actually able to find it upfront before it impacts the entire set of users. You're taking a very proactive approach. You're actually getting feedback from production very frequently or in a very short time span, and you can actually take corrective actions faster. Definitely, you're going to cover additional scenarios that you're not able to cover in your staging environment when you're testing in production, which definitely is going to improve your overall software quality. So it's actually going to give more experience to your users. It's actually going to give you more confidence to make frequent releases to production. You're actually minimizing the impact of failures that are there. You're able to get feedback faster. Your infrastructure is very costly to be actually set up in staging. It might make sense to actually do a bit of testing in production. You don't have to invest in a lot of hardware or infrastructure to actually do your testing. You can definitely save money there. You're actually taking proactive approach. You may have lesser number of tickets coming into production because of a big failure happening. You're also reducing on a cost of quality. So you're definitely saving cost also by testing in production. To summarize, what I would say is you should actually be evaluating the risk associated with testing in production. Definitely there are benefits. You should be definitely comparing the risk versus the benefits. And I'm sure that in the coming years, this practice is actually going to grow because of the pressure that the testing teams are having or the product teams are having with respect to releasing software faster. So this practice is actually going to continue, and you can also see more advancements coming in this area in terms of practices as well as tools. So I hope you enjoyed listening to the presentation. I would definitely love to gather feedback from each one of you. And also, I would say, I think you should actually go back and look at how that you can implement some of these practices in your projects. So thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
That was a great session by George. So that's it for this session. So thank you all. Let's meet in the next session.